Hello, everybody. Glad to have you with us this afternoon. And we're excited about this series that we've been enjoying for the last several months now. The Am I OK series is sponsored by the Pastoral Evangelism and Leadership Council. I'm Dr. Jesse Wilson. I'm the director of the Pastoral Evangelism and Leadership Council. Incidentally, this Sunday night at 7 o'clock p.m., we'll begin our 41st gathering of PELC. And we want you to go to pelc2020.com. We've got some great speakers this year. Many of you have seen the information. We'll have Ron Smith, and we'll have Myron Edmonds and Howard John Wesley from the DMV, Calvin Watkins. There's a person who's missing from this particular graphic. That's Dr. Gina Smith from Memphis, Tennessee. We're just going to have a fantastic time. I was listening to some of the sermons, and Johnson Cesar from Florida, powerful message. You don't want to miss it. And so Sunday night, we begin our time together at the Pastoral Evangelism and Leadership Council. You can register today at PELC 2020. And in the spirit of PELC, for the last several months, we have been conducting a series entitled Am I OK? We've been looking at leadership wellness. Leadership wellness is the theme for PELC 2020, Selah, Strength for the Struggle. And we've been led by Kim Mann and Amanda Harley and Edsel Cadet and Richard Martin and who else? I know I'm missing someone else, but the point is we've had great leadership. Ainsworth Joseph from Northeastern. We've had great leadership month to month, some incredible seminars. And today we're going to do a presentation that I think is going to be very, very timely from the Am I OK series. And it's actually entitled, I'm Not OK, an honest conversation about moral failure. And we want to go ahead and get started. We've got some great panelists today, and we want to indeed have a conversation. Listen, we want to engage you also. Feel free to ask any questions, put them in the chat feature. Take some time right now to share with your contacts that we are up and running. This Facebook Live presentation is up, and you can get it on YouTube. Get as many of your friends on board as possible. You will be blessed and informed by this conversation. Let's go ahead and see who's with us today. I want each of the panelists to take just a moment and introduce themselves, beginning with my friend, Chaplain Benton. Good to have you.
Good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Chaplain Adrienne Benton, and my ministry context is I'm currently serving as a chaplain in the United States Navy, and really glad to be here, a part of this conversation today. Thank you.
Fantastic. Chaplain Benton has been with us before, and we're seriously thinking about running some of the previous webinars that we did because she has really been a great contribution. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And we're glad to have Nestor Bruno.
Hello, everyone. I was thinking if I'm glad to be here, I wish we wouldn't have to be discussing these things, as I'm sure all of you feel like me. But I'm glad that we are talking. Yes, yeah. I'm glad that we are talking about these things and sharing together. I'm a pastor. I'm also a psychologist for the past 15 years. And now with a wonderful group of counselors, we do ministry care services, and we serve a little bit more than 5,000 ministerial families in the States, Canada, England, Sweden, Caribbean, so a few places. So our passion is caring for our ministerial families. I'm glad to be here with you talking today.
And I'm so glad you're here. You have heard probably of Dr. Miller. He's been doing quite a bit of work lately in the area of Pastoral. Pastoral is dealing with issues in our community, social justice issues, but he also has an expertise in this area that we're uncovering today. So glad to have you, Nicholas Miller.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a professor at the seminary where I teach church history, but I think for purposes of this discussion, my other hat is more important. I'm an attorney, and I'm the legal counsel for the Lake Union Conference. And over the last couple of years, I've helped them implement a special reporting and investigation program regarding sexual abuse called Project Safe Church. And it's carried out under an NAD working policy that unfortunately all too many people don't know about. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation today about how you can make your church and conference a safer place.
As are we. We really are interested in the Safe Church program. One of my favorite people, Dee Knight, is here. Dr. Knight, tell us about yourself.
Hi, I am a doctor of clinical neuropsychology. I practice in Alabama. I have a private practice, and I am all about sexual abuse recovery and sexual assault recovery, so I'm happy to be here.
Good people she is. And then Edsel Cadet is not only a member of the committee, our steering committee for PELC, but he's also been very involved in this Am I OK series. Dr. Cadet, tell us about yourself.
Not doctor just yet. We can go ahead and prophesy, though. I am a pastor from the Northeastern Conference. I pastor the Cambridge Seventh-day Adventist Church. I'm currently pursuing a master's in clinical mental health counseling with a concentration in marriage and family therapy and an emphasis in African and Caribbean mental health. So looking forward to how we can continue to work together in this conversation.
Yeah. Again, I want to thank you for your involvement along with DeAndrea Jackson, Amanda Hawley, Richard Martin, and Ainsworth Joseph. These are the individuals who have really worked hard to bring these meaningful webinars to us. So thanks again, guys. Now, the tagline for today's webinar is an honest conversation about moral failure. But we are talking specifically about sexual misconduct. And what is it about sexual misconduct against the backdrop of moral failures that makes it that much more challenging? What is it about sexual misconduct that takes it to a whole nother level of moral failure, or does it?
At times, I think the perspective seems to be more grave because many times we perceive sexual misconduct to be an ultimate betrayal of what is good, what is right, what is decent, attached with a sense of helplessness in the restoration process. Do I forgive? How do I forgive?
Yeah.
So sometimes sexual misconduct can be perceived to be much more grave as far as what it is and the impact.
Certainly. Anybody else?
Yeah, thank you, Chaplain Benton. I also believe that it's a safety issue. And when we're talking about an issue of safety, we're talking about all of us. So when we conceptualize sexual abuse, sexual assault, sexual misconduct, it's not an issue about sex so much as it's an issue about power. And I want to repeat that. It is not a problem with sex. It is a problem with power. And a lot of what we're divided about as a nation, as a church, as a people in general, has to do with power, the privilege of safety, like who gets to be safe, who gets to expect safety as a basic right, not just some extra that you have to fight for and win, but women's advancement, women's leadership, all of those things in an organization. That's a safety issue because any group that's excluded from power is going to be at a disadvantage as far as safety, and that inherently affects all of us. So I think that that's something that we have to remember.
The magnitude of it, the fallout from it, distinguishes sexual misconduct from a number of the quote red lights that we've been wrestling with lately. I'm curious though, it seems that we're hearing more about sexual misconduct these last several months. Are there more incidents? Is the media more sensitive to it? What's your read? I know we've always had this issue, always. But are there more incidents? What's your feel for that?
That's a great question. From my perspective, I don't know necessarily that there's more. I think this is a cycle that as human beings, we've just been dealing with in general. But with COVID-19, the coronavirus, this season that we're in, people have more time when it comes to exposures, when it comes to, right now, COVID-19 has truly shined the light on things that we weren't paying attention to previously. So while it may seem like all of these things are brand new, when you unpeel the onion, these occurrences, either they have taken place a long time ago and now they're coming out, or they've been going on for a while, but it's only now that it's actually coming to the forefront.
Yeah.
And people have more support.
People have more.
Absolutely. If you think 40, 50 years ago, anyone was going to be having a Me Too movement, no. And so now that you have strength in numbers, right, you see other people sharing their stories, and it's like, wait a second, I have that same experience. And sometimes you don't even realize that you were abused. Sometimes you don't realize that you were being manipulated, right? And so when you start hearing other people's stories and it starts hitting you like, oh, wait a second, that pastor who was hitting on me over and over when I told him to stop, that was abusive. Yes. If you were one of his congregants, absolutely. And so when you start hearing other people's stories, it starts giving you the strength to be able to come forward as well.
You know, Pastor Bruno, let me ask you about this. One of the questions that keeps coming up is the lack of preparation that we see in our theology departments, undergrad level. I'm wondering if you have any contribution to make in that area. What could we be doing as we train pastors to prepare them for this problem?
Thank you for the question. And as I was listening just now, I was thinking about how moments of crisis, like the one we are living in every single corner of the world, show things that when the crisis is not going on, sometimes it's more difficult to see. But when a crisis arrives, then you cannot hide it anymore. Because we are not only thinking about these challenges, I'm thinking about marital problems, anxiety, depression, addictions, and you keep going with the list, that they became so obvious that we have great problems in these areas everywhere, with the pandemic even more. But going back to your question, Dr. Wilson, what can we do to prepare our leaders, our religious leaders in seminary for these things? And this is a question that I also get quite a bit. I would say two things. One, we cannot prepare them in seminary for everything they are going to face. Impossible. I mean, none of us, I see Dr. Nicholas as a lawyer, I see Pastor Edsel or chaplain or Dr. Knight as a psychologist. We were not prepared in a school for everything we were going to face. But something we learned in school, at least I remember that, preparing myself to help others, was that I didn't have all the answers. And it was good for me to do supervision. I had to do residency. I had to look for mentors. I had to do that. That's something I remember very clearly when I was being trained as a psychologist. When I was being trained as a pastor, I had to have all the answers. I had to know all the passages. I have to be a counselor in any situation. I had to know what God wanted to tell this person, whatever they were going through. And the reality is that we don't know. We are not prepared for everything. So I don't want to be too long, but so important to be aware of our ignorance, our limitations, our boundaries, because I talk to very, very good leaders, very religious leaders with a huge heart for others, for the church, and they feel like they have to know, and they even feel guilty. And sometimes this need of control and knowing can lead you into compulsive behaviors, obsessive behaviors, addictive behaviors to compensate, because there is pain, because I don't know, I cannot. And then you need to compensate somehow. And many times we compensate in ways that are toxic, sinful, painful. So I would say you don't need to know everything. We need to do something to prepare and help, but I would say we need to start letting them know that they need others, they need help, they cannot know everything.
That's good. That's good.
I want to add to that as somebody who's recently graduated from seminary. Pastors are learning on the fly how to manage the influence that comes with our position. There isn't a lot that is done to prepare us emotionally and psychologically for the influence that comes along with it and the perils that come along with that kind of influence. I remember, day one of seminary, they had a pastor come and speak to us and just share with us some of the things that we need to be aware of. Don't give women rides in your car, things of that nature. But I'm suggesting a more thorough unpacking of the self. And like Dr. Bruno said, being aware of your limitations. I think that means recognizing that in our society, men are socialized to suppress emotion. We are socialized to be angry. We are socialized to show strength through power. We are socialized to display our sexuality as it's driven by our ego, and to measure our worth by the people that we're able to hook up with, right? And now when you look at how men are socialized like that, and then women are socialized to be demure, to say yes, and to be good, it's creating a dynamic in society where men are being socialized to be predators and women are being socialized to be prey. Now, I'm not saying that the roles can't be reversed, but I'm saying that as pastors, we need to become more aware of the fact that we have been socialized a certain way, especially throughout our teenage and young adult years. And then when we enter into power and position, there's a paradigm shift where we are expected to not act on the socialization that has taken place. So there's a lot of unpacking that has to take place there, so that the message that we have for our ministers and also for our members regarding sexuality is not just abstinence. Dr. Wesley Knight says in his book Thirst that it's sustenance that leads to abstinence, that you cannot truly adequately and for a long time abstain if you are not sustained. If you're hungry, you're going to eat, right? So learning to be emotionally sustained, spiritually sustained in the ways that are critical to our sexuality and to how we manage power lead to good conduct down the road.
What is the extent of the problem? I'm curious. I've noticed online particularly that when we begin to discuss sexual misconduct, particularly in the Adventist church, that there's often some pushback when we begin to talk about it being a big problem. Some people refuse to acknowledge that it's a problem at all. Dr. Miller, I'm curious. We're going to talk about the Safe Church program in the Lake Union, but you have some experience in this area. What do you think about the range or the extent of this sexual misconduct problem in the Adventist church?
Well, I think it's more widespread than we would like, and maybe even more widespread than we fear. I don't know the answer to that question because it doesn't all come to the surface at the same time. We don't have statistics on it, and at least widely available. And the statistics I have seen, are alarming, that we are similar to other Protestant denominations in terms of the number of predators that we have. They certainly exist. We know that on an anecdotal basis. But our absence of knowledge in this area is almost as big a concern for me as the actual problem, because I think that as a church, we haven't done what we could do and what we should do in terms of documenting and sharing. There's been, we've criticized the Catholic Church for moving predatory priests around, and Pope John Paul II, now it's come out that he knew a great deal more about predators and moved them up the ranks in the church. And I wish that I could say the Adventist Church has been entirely different, but unfortunately it hasn't so much. And we just have some legal practices where I've just seen in the last month where credible accusations are made against pastors and leaders. Lawsuits are threatened and even brought. And then a settlement is entered into that includes what we call NDAs, or non-disclosure agreements. And so nobody is able to talk about it after the fact. Mm-hmm. And I just think that's ethically and morally wrong, because we are part of a united church, and we should be warning other parts of the church when we know there's a wolf in our midst. And we sign these NDAs, and we suddenly cripple everyone, including the victim, including the church leaders. And not only should we not sign these NDAs, we should be affirmatively keeping track at the division level, as well as at the union and conference level, of sexual predators, of people that are on sex offender lists, of people that either the state has found or we have found to be misbehaving, and not necessarily at a criminal level of proof, right? There's a civil level of more likely than not, which is adequate and sufficient for church discipline. And if you go and speak to your conference or union or division leaders and ask them if they're doing these things, 95% you're going to get the answer they're not, because they're afraid of the liability that goes with recording that information. They would rather
make the distinction between civil level and criminal level insofar as accumulating names, what the conference can or cannot do.
Now, this is an extremely important point that many people are not straight on, including church leaders. How many times have you heard this? Oh, there's an accusation against pastor so-and-so or brother so-and-so. We need to let the police do their job and stay out of the way, and then, you know, they can determine if there's a problem or not. The reason that's deeply problematic is that the burden of proof in a criminal case is beyond a reasonable doubt, which is like 90% likelihood. But that's only to stop you from going to jail, right? Going to jail, they should have to prove it at a very high level. But church membership and protecting our children draw on a different level of proof, and that is the civil level of more likely than not, like 50% plus a feather. And so the church cannot put this into the hands of law enforcement, because it almost doesn't matter what law enforcement does. It doesn't remove the obligation from the church to investigate themselves and find out if it's more likely than not that this happened. And if they find that it is more likely than not that it happened, that they should act with discipline and safety for other potential victims, irrespective of what the police say. And that has been a great failing on our part, is to sit back and let the police sort of work their job. Often they'll dismiss cases, not because it didn't happen, but because of the difficulty of evidence or proving up to this higher level. And we need to be much more responsible as a church in both investigating these cases and then keeping a record across conferences and unions in the division so that we can track this problem in the way that it needs to be tracked.
Yeah, we need to double back. When we talk about the Safe Church program, I want to double back, talk about that a bit more. Let me go back to a question that has been raised several times. What can we do? What can the local conferences do? I want to frame this right. What can local conferences be doing right now to prepare congregations and local pastors for this sexual misconduct problem that we're dealing with? And I would also add, I think it's more of a problem than we admit. I think it's much more of a problem than we admit, but that's for another day. How can we prepare our local pastors and our local churches for this problem?
I want to say something, and it's very related to what you're asking and also what Dr. Miller just said. And it's that if we start treating, and the lion's share of the victimhood is going to women and children, right? So if we start treating women and children, maybe as importantly as we treat our money, perhaps we will see some change. And what do I mean by that? And what Dr. Miller was saying is that you don't wait when you hear somebody might be embezzling funds or somebody might be taking money from the offering plate. You don't wait until the police have done an investigation. Yes, pass it off to the police so that they can do their investigation. But I guarantee that person will not be counting money by themselves, right? So if we can start treating women and children just as importantly as we treat our money, perhaps we'll start seeing some change. So we have to start valuing people a little more than we do right now and recognizing that we don't. And the reality is we don't. If we really valued people a little more than we did, and maybe perhaps as much as we did our money, we would have some accountability measures in place, period.
Okay, Dee's fired up. It's early, Dee.
I'm always fired up. This is how I am.
The pastors. What can we do for our pastors to prepare them? What can we do
I'll
at
add,
the and not only to prepare them for churches that have already been wounded, but what can we prepare them? How can we prepare them individually in the ways that they've not been prepared? At least that's the assumption. Uh, Undergrad, seminary. What can we do?
Well, something that Pastor Cadet said already, right? Imagine if every pastor in training right now, every student, every theology major, just as obviously as they're groomed right now to go out there and get you a spouse so that you don't fall into sin, which is a bad idea, by the way. The burden of pastor spouses somehow keeping them from sexual sin, right? Imagine if they are trained to understand what power is about. This is something that Pastor Cadet brought up, the influence that comes with the position that you hold, right? How it can be used for such a good thing, but also for atrocities. Like, what if someone explicitly told them that simply based on the nature of what they do, on the position that they hold, just based on the fact that you are in the role of pastor, that you will be more likely to misinterpret random interactions as sexual when they're not? This is what the research tells us. When people are given power, they misinterpret things. That there's no shame in that. It just means that you need to have a little more of your interpretations maybe run by someone else before acting on them. Like, what if someone did some continuing education or what have you for our current or future ministers, reminding them that not only the ethics of not dating members in their church, which a lot of pastors say they don't even know that, they don't hear that until they come out of seminary, right? Those things should be explicitly taught in some type of manner so that people are getting the same ethical message. This is not okay, right? No matter how enticing the person may be, no matter how much you think that they're interested in you, if you are a shepherd, you should not be feeding on the sheep, right? And so what if we just go in and actually educate people in these areas that power over someone precludes consent, right? That if we go in and actually explicitly teach these things, we will get rid of a lot of the issues, the misconceptions that people end up having.
Yeah, I think that in much the same way that COVID has accelerated some things that we needed to take care of, I think this is an example of an unforeseen benefit of some of these online examples. It's forcing us to recognize that we have a problem, even if we don't know the extent of the problem.
To go off what Dr. Knight was saying, it's so real. Like, even for me, I've had to learn on the fly that I cannot operate under the same ethical rules that I operated under when I was an undergrad studying English. Like, I could talk on the phone with somebody till 10 at night and walk away, and it means nothing. And then I had to learn as a pastor, it means something very different to a congregate, that it can be interpreted very differently. But these are things that, we're discovering along the way, that, as Dr. Knight said, these things should be communicated up front and often. Part of the other issue that we have, though, is that, we are very clear on what we do when a young lady gets pregnant. But then when a pastor has a fall, we're humming and hawing. We don't have procedure. We have procedure, we have policy, but it doesn't seem like those things are always followed through on. And I think that exacerbates the hurt. Part of the challenge with that is that we're asking men, who are typically the predators, to create the policies and the procedures that would protect others. So what this means is, I think, is that we have to make sure that women are playing a critical role in the policy shaping, so that we can have our blind spots covered. Because we're not going to see it all. We're not socialized to see it all. We have a certain level of privilege that we operate with by being men in this world, that causes us to just not see some of the dangers of our own actions or of the things that go on in the church.
Yeah.
May I say something? Yeah. I think one of the things we need to get rid of is that it won't happen to me. We need to get rid of that. All of us say it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. And sometimes I get asked this question because I work mainly with pastors and their families. Some people ask me, and what are the most common problems that pastors have, and their families? First, thinking that I'm going to tell them like something, the pastors have this and that problem. But that question that it surprises me many times, it comes from an ignorance that pastors and their families, they have the same issues and the same problems as anyone else. Who made us believe that we were a little bit different in any way? So we have the same problems, the same issues, the same challenges, the same everything. So whatever we see in society, let's be ready and prepared, because we will see it at church and we will see it in our leadership. Of course, that we want our leaders to be different. We want them to set the example, but statistically, we will see the same issues that we see in society also in church. So one more thing, that this has to do more with Adventism, and I think that it has to do with any other religion too. We like to say, we like to believe that we are the chosen ones. And you ask any religious group and they will tell you, we are the chosen. And we have the truth, and we have the message, and we have this and that. So sometimes this idea that we are the chosen, we are especially blessed by God in some special way, and some triumphalistic, I don't know if I said it right in English, but this idea, it's actually toxic and not psychologically helpful, because of course, all of us, we are chosen by God. All of us, we have a beautiful mission given by Him, but that doesn't make us any special. Peter denied Jesus and he was walking with him with a beautiful mission. So it doesn't make us anything different than a human being with lots of faults and problems and challenges and beauty and grace and etc. So the notion that we are the chosen and this will not happen to us because we are so special and so blessed in a different way, let's get rid of that. That's not real.
It's not.
When I was in seminary, Dr. Wilson, at that time, they had us go to, there was a resident psychologist, and every seminarian had to go and have, I think you had about 2 or 3 sessions. And in that session, it was a deep session where they would ask you about yourself. And the big thing was, do you know who you are? Because when you don't understand who you are, then who you're trying to be ends up bleeding on everybody else, and hurting people hurt people. One of the things when we look at what can be done, so in our undergrad, in our seminaries, I would like to propose that there should be a more concentrated time where seminarians and undergrad, where they are talking to maybe an outside professional that is hired to come in and have these deeper level conversations, because many times we have blind spots that we're aware of, but we're blind to the impact that those spots have. And Barna Research Group says that right now, pastors, the top 8 issues that pastors are struggling with is knowing how to balance the wrestling between criticism and conflict, family problems, stress, depression, burnout, sexual problems like pornography and marital unfaithfulness, financial problems, and time management. When we unpeel the onion for many incidences of sexual misconduct, a part of the scenario of that person's life was loneliness, anger, hungry, as far as feeling a lack of emotional satisfaction, right? Mm-hmm. And so if we took some time as a community to, one, in the process of our training, provide opportunities, really mandate, but provide opportunities for those who are going into the ministry field to almost in some ways have a life coach, like really sit down and have an understanding of who you are, the call of God that is on your life in tandem with those sins that so easily beset you, causing people to walk out with some sort of life plan on how, through the power of God, they will continue to be intentional with the wrestlings that they have so that they don't bleed out on people. Two, to our local pastors, there are some conferences that provide free counseling sessions. They give you a ticket and say, your name won't be written down. You take that ticket to these said counseling providers whenever you need to go. And you know, with these day and age, we are dealing with stress as providers on such a deep level that many of us are dealing with compassion fatigue. And compassion fatigue in the church, compassion fatigue at home, you find yourself in crisis, and then the window opens for the opportunities that you never thought you would allow yourself to engage in to actually come to fulfillment. The second thing that I want to say is just when it comes to sex and sexuality, we don't talk about it in a way that's honest as a church. So many times when these situations happens, it's these closed door conversations that never really bring us to a place of restoration or resolution. When we say the victims should be able to feel safe, and how can anybody feel safe if we never engage in the conversation? So part of it is, even now, pastors, church work leaders, let's go ahead and allow our congregations in small fragments to be able to have professionals that come in and have conversations about sexuality, have conversations about boundaries. What does it mean to set boundaries? What does that look like? How do you know that somebody is infringing on your personal space? These are conversations that we need to teach our children. These are conversations that we need to have among ourselves, that will lead us towards holding our institution and each other accountable.
Amen. Thank you, Chaplain Benton. Can I say something real quick to what Mr. Bruno was saying? There was a study of about 250 men who had, quote unquote, fallen in ministry. And the study found three things. None of them had personal accountability. Almost all of them had stopped having their personal daily devotional times. And all of them were convinced that it could not happen to them. Every single person was convinced it could not happen to them. We have to get rid of the notion that we're good people. That's not to rag on anybody, right? That's not to dog anybody. But I mean, that's what the Bible tells us, right? Our righteousness is as filthy rags. This idea that we are good people, that's the problem. The problem is that it is not about the individual. So when we talk about preventing sexual abuse and preventing sexual assault, there is something very important. We talk about the fact that we go by policy, not by the person. So like when I don't send my child alone with an adult where they're not going to be observed, that doesn't have to do with, I think that you're going to molest my child. It has to do with, this is a policy that I'm following. Because guess what? The reality is we can all have an opportunity to be bad people. And so that's what I'm saying. Like when we give people power, this is what the research shows us, is that there's like a part of our brain that stops working correctly. And you don't even know how depraved you can be. That's why the word tells us that the heart is deceitful above all else. Who can know it? You don't even know. And so we have to get rid of the notion that we're good people, or, oh, that's such a good person. And so we trust people with this power without accountability. Anytime you have power without accountability, it is disastrous. We have to have accountability in place.
What would be some of the warning signs that a pastor is kind of teetering on the edge of predatory behavior, sexual misconduct? What would be some indications?
Can I say that long before we even get to predatory behaviors, again, we have to acknowledge that this can happen to anyone. And so it's really not so much about the character.
That's my question. That's why you hijacked my question.
What did you say? I missed what you said.
No, I said that's a great question. Great point.
Yeah. So before we even get to the predatory stuff, right, it's not so much about the character of the individual, but about the power structure of the organization. What powers are being distributed and how? Who is being allowed to have free reign over the sheep? Right? To be honest, the way that we gain power is by helping others, by uplifting our community, by being charismatic and well-liked, all of the things that we often want our ministers to be, all of the things that we tell our pastors to do, right? But the paradox is that once you get all of those things, once you do all of those things, then you're given power, and oftentimes you're given power without oversight, right? So you know that you're beginning to go down that slippery slope of moral failure, that slippery slope of misusing and abusing your power. Are you keeping secrets? Right? Are you hiding things? Are you keeping things just to yourself? Tucking like maybe habits and conversations or behaviors into dark spaces that you don't share with anyone else, right? So again, getting rid of the notion that you're a good person. Are you choosing accountability? That would be one of the signs if you don't have accountability. We don't have time for pastors who aren't willing to be accountable, right? And most sexual abuse is not predatory, it is opportunistic. Most abuses of power, because it's not about the person. It's not because they're inherently an immoral person. It's because you have a person who rose to power with greater speed than their accountability. What does that mean, and why does it matter? It means that you don't have a bad person necessarily. You can't just be a good person. You have to have some oversight with your opportunities, right? Anytime you have actions that don't have accountability, when power is unchecked, that's all it takes. So if you see situations where people don't have to answer to somebody else, that's how we know we're going to start seeing some predatory behaviors. Why? Because they're human, and that's what human beings do.
Well, let me give some let me frame this a different way. So this has been an issue for years. I can't think of a time in my ministry when this has not been an issue. It's been handled it has not been handled well ever. So in the absence of names, and so we have an incident that's exasperated by online presence. And so an accusation is being made that a pastor in my field has been inappropriate. A pastor in my field has been a predator. Dr. Miller, I want to, and this is for everybody, but I want to kind of go down this narrative a bit. If a local conference has received an online accusation of a pastor being a predator or some type of sexual misconduct involving the pastor, what would be your suggested route for the conference to take?
So I would say run and not walk to the NAD policy E87. And the reason I say that is because it's hard for a church, possible for a church to investigate itself, right? Who's the most powerful person in the church? It's the pastor. And so whoever does the investigating, there's always going to be the sense that the pastor is actually controlling what's going on. So what do? You have the conference. The problem with the conference is that many outsiders, anyway, view the leadership of the church as the all-male boys club. And so the conference leadership has an interest in not having the church exposed to liability, which is true. And they don't want this to be true. And that's true as well. And I know many conference leaders and officials, and I think they're generally men of integrity, but that's part of the problem. They're all men. And so if they look into it themselves and then they vindicate the pastor, there's always going to be this aura of suspicion that this was just swept under the rug. This was the old boys club. Well, this is where E87 comes into place, because it divides the investigatory role from the decision-making role, and it sets up a sexual ethics committee of 5 individuals, the majority of whom should not be church employees, but should be qualified laypersons. It also appoints a concerned care practitioner who is sort of a victim advocate, not in a legal sense, but an advocate in helping them understand their story and helping them tell their story in the most effective way possible. And in this sexual ethics...
E87 is church policy, E87 is suggested policy.
It's the North American division, the Red Book, right? E87 in the Red Book. And
let me underscore this point. One of the problems that we ran into immediately a couple of months ago was I was talking to Pastor Dana Edmond, who's working with the Office of Regional Conference Ministries, and just looking at the policies, as you just mentioned, that are already in place that we're ignoring, just exasperates the problem. It's not as if we don't have recourse. I think we're either ignoring recourse or we're ignorant of recourse. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's a great point, because the policy, I think, is incredibly good, but it's not the simplest in the world. And I think you have to train sexual ethics committee members, you have to train concerned care practitioners, and you don't do that overnight. You have to put together a program that will train people to investigate this. How do you witness witnesses? How do you look at evidence? How do you deal with victims, at least alleged victims initially? And so we have training programs to create pools of qualified individuals that can be drawn on to fill those roles. The fact is, most conferences and unions haven't done that, to carry out this policy is almost beyond their ability without that background preparation. And so they throw a hasty executive committee together with the officers to look at a few things, and they come to their decision. But they lose the power of this policy, which removes the officers from investigating the facts, makes it more objective, and just as importantly, more trustworthy from an outside perspective. And then they can take the recommendation of this disinterested, impartial, trained group. That sexual ethics committee doesn't actually decide the outcome or the discipline. It's the employer of the individual, or even the church board if it's a local elder. But it would be very unwise of them to ignore the recommendation of this sexual ethics committee group. And then the concerned care practitioner is there so that the victim doesn't feel like they're being re-victimized again, right? It's like, okay, you've been victimized. Now we're going to put you in front of these 3 or 4 men, make you tell your story again, and they may or may not believe you. No, you work through this counselor who's been trained in helping people tell their stories, and you go before a mixed panel that includes men and women who can hear your story much more sympathetically. It also protects the church as well by creating this objective outside group. My experience is that 99% of church leaders, they want to catch the predators and the abusers as well. They're just afraid of the legal procedure and the headlines and everything that goes with it. And it's often that pressure which pushes them to do something like an NDA or not to come to full grips with it. So this is a very powerful policy if we choose to follow it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's continue the narrative. So an accusation has been made. An accusation is being pursued. I'm curious, Chaplain, you and Dee, your perspective on this. The other thing that we hear quite frequently is if your accusation is accurate, you need to be willing to step forward. What about the reluctance of victims to, well, I don't want to lead you into that. What do you think about that? The fact is we seem to have, in many people's eyes, too few victims willing to come forward.
Yeah, it goes back to educating people on, if we're having open conversations about sex, about sexuality, we have to really be able to educate people on what it is to have been sexually assaulted as well, right? If we don't prepare people for the reality that that might happen and the fallout of what it might look like afterwards, right? So if we really use our brains and think for a moment, sexual assault, sexual abuse is sometimes some of the most shame-filled moments of a person's life if they experience that. Now, would you go and have the most shame-filled moment of your life and you're going to go and talk about it immediately? More than likely not. It usually takes a lot of healing. It usually takes a lot of encouragement for someone to ever come forward. Most people don't ever come forward, right? So why we're expecting victims, somehow the onus to be on them to come forward is beyond me. Once again, if you have even the inkling that somebody might be stealing money, you're going to remove them from that position. You don't have to accuse them of anything. You just have to say, you know what, this isn't the right place for you. So likewise, and what happens oftentimes, yeah, go ahead.
To that point though. So the response would be that, well, the response that some would make is that, listen, we recognize and acknowledge that this is a significant problem. Mm-hmm. And but there are also individuals who are making false accusations. And so how do you sort out without questioning the legitimacy of the problem or the range of the problem, the extent of the problem, how do you separate out the need for individuals to come forward and subject themselves to the process that you just described? How do we get at it if they're not coming forward? And what can we do to encourage them to come forward if that's really the answer?
Okay, so this idea that you just said that some people are making false accusations, right? We first of all, we stop highlighting that so much because that's like 0.002%, right? It's a really small percentage of people that make false accusations about being sexually assaulted. It's about the same as any other felony that people falsely report on, right? But I never hear people falsely talking about having been robbed in an alley. but we believe people, right? So the first thing we have to do is set an environment where we believe people who come forward. So when we have like a pastor who maybe hasn't been educated on this and goes on the pulpit and says, well, there's some people who are also making false accusations, that creates an environment that is unsafe. That creates an environment where people are not going to come forward because you know what? They just elevated telling the truth and telling a lie at the same level, and it's not happening at the same rate. And so when you elevate some things that really ought not even be talked about because it's not even that big of a deal, that becomes an issue for people coming forward. You're creating an environment where people don't feel safe coming forward.
Yeah.
And I think it's also really important too to understand that most times there are three things that victims want. Number one, as mentioned already, they want to know that they're going to be safe, right? They want to know that they're going to be physically safe and emotionally safe. They also want to know that from an emotional standpoint, that they have some outlet to be able to tell their story, right? And then number three, they also want to know what's going to come next. So this goes back to the whole thing of educating our community, even from now, as Dr. Miller is talking to us, you know, those of us who are in leadership, pastors, find out what is the process and begin to educate your community. Take the stigma off of counseling. Find out what are the resources in your community. There's many hotlines for victims. There's many different resources so that if somebody is in that place where they have been victimized and they're not ready yet to come to the church, guess what? They can start with an outside entity, get the support, and then with help come into. But you want to create an environment where people are free to tell their story, where they understand that as much as possible, we will do our best to provide protection. And then finally, letting them know what the process is. You know, we can't 100% guarantee that no one will ever experience any sort of re-victimization when they're going through the process, but we can do our best to be honest and open and really walk with people in a non-judgmental manner. And that takes every one of us making that choice and decision on how to be a part of the community and helping.
Yeah, and we have to talk about it. I can't tell you how many times I have talked about whether it's sexual abuse, sexual assault, abortion, and I've had people come up to me and say, I have never heard that from behind the pulpit before. Never. We're talking about 50, 60, 70 years in church, and you've never heard anyone talk about abortion. You've never heard anyone talk about sexual abuse. And you have members who are sitting there who have been sexually abused, and there's no space to talk about it. That should not be.
Yeah, I also think our members and our pastors have the attention span of a gnat when it comes to situations like this. I was literally amazed at how quickly these issues of sexual misconduct just totally ran off of social media. Of course, the election was being held, but I'm the moderator. I'm not going to impose my.
Preach, Jesse. Go ahead.
Oh, but let me ask you. I want to go back to. Within the context of E87, Dr. Miller or Bruno, maybe you can jump in here. Where is that place of safety for the person to bring his or her accusations?
Well, the initial contact is with a concerned care practitioner, right? So it's not somebody who's going to judge you or criticize you, but is more of a counselor kind of person. Now, that person isn't meant to do the literal counseling, but is meant to listen sympathetically to your story and help you write it up in a way that is easy to understand and clear. And under our guidelines, you don't have to. I'm sorry, did I disappear for a moment?
No, you good. Go ahead.
Okay. Under our guidelines, you don't actually have to move beyond the concerned care practitioner stage, because some people may or may not know whether their allegation rises to the level of seriousness. Do they want to go fully public or not? And you can consult and counsel with that person and talk through it and decide either that it's not that serious or that you do want to move forward. And then at that stage, the officers are alerted that there's an issue, there's a claim being made, and they need to pull together a group, a sexual ethics committee of mixed gender, of lay persons and some church leaders to look at the written statement and to start gathering evidence regarding it. And it takes victims seriously, but it doesn't do away with due process. I will take a little bit of an issue. I've been studying this field for a while, and I think 0.02% false rate is not quite right. I think it's closer to 2%. Still, that's very small. And so the fact is, most accusations are true and should be believed, but there are enough people making false claims that we do want to assess it and look at the evidence and consider it, because false accusations can ruin somebody's life. And, you know, the first story of sexual harassment or claim of sexual assault that we can think of in the Bible wasn't true, the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. So these things do happen. And I used to work in government, and I defended cases where, in fact, it wasn't true. And in fact, sexual abuse claims can be a form of power themselves. If you think about the Salem witch trials, claiming to be a witch or accusing others of being a witch was a form of power. And if we start just believing all claims mindlessly and without examining them, it can become a form of power that is used and misused. But the fact is, most of the claims are true. We do need to have a system that sorts through them, and that's what E87 does.
Pastor Bruno, let me ask you this question. What can we do as local pastors to create almost a peer context that would kind of help identify those who have issues? In other words, what can we do as pastors for the problem that pastors have?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question. Actually, maybe the first thing we can do is go back to this idea that we all have issues. It's not like, oh, who has an issue here? Let's be, vigilant so we can find that person. Because that person can be our best friend, can be myself, can be anyone. What I mean is that I was listening to all of you, and some of the things that we were mentioning leaders that feel lonely, that are dealing with a lot of anger. Just to talk a little bit about that, anger. When you see someone that is too angry, or you are too angry, ask yourself, what am I sad about? Because anger and sadness, they are like, you flip the coin and it's the same coin. It's both sides of kind of the same. So when we are very angry and irritable, what are we sad about? That we are not talking, not connecting with. What we should be looking for, Dr. Wilson, is all of those things that we don't accept, we don't surrender to our higher power, like in the 12 steps programs we say, or we don't give and open it to others. Those things are very toxic. Loneliness, it's a magnifier glass. Anything you see or look through loneliness, it becomes bigger. And that's one of the challenges of leadership. It's a lonely calling. It's a lonely vocation many times. So sadness, anger, loneliness. Chaplain was just talking about hunger, emotional hunger, because that opens the door to looking in places that we shouldn't be looking for that support, for that emotional, help. And another one that I see a lot that we should be looking at ourselves as leaders and also looking for our friends, how they are doing, is being extremely tired, being extremely burnt out. I mean, how can we live a healthy life in any area if we are extremely tired, no energy? I talk all the time with colleagues of mine in the mental health field. I talk with leaders in church. We are all burnt out at the end of this 2020 that was a crazy year. So a wonderful thing we can tell a friend is, man, take a vacation. But I mean it for real. When are you taking it? Let's open the agenda together. I will help you to and then you help me. And we stop and take a vacation. Many times that can prevent something that will cost years of suffering and pain and recovery. And let me say something just briefly. I don't know if we are going into that now, but I would like to talk, because we talked a lot about the predators, and actually the predators are victims themselves in many cases. So that's also my concern. What are we doing for these people that have been victims of different situations in life, and then in a very sick and sinful way, they look for, I don't know what word to use, they look for a bad coping skill to cope with whatever they are going through, and they do things that they can regret for a lifetime. They hurt others and hurt themselves. So our leaders are also victims. I come from a pastoral family, and I have seen friends of mine going through this. Their parents, they went through a situation, their dad, they left ministry. It's a very painful road also for that minister and that family. So I don't know if we are going to talk about that, but I think we need to also look at the leaders that go through a lot of pain after something they have done that they never thought they were able to do.
Yeah, well,
and now they
if
are
I
there.
have, and I pastored for a number of years, let's drill down on that a bit. We have been very intentional the last several years about who's teaching our kids. So if I find out that a Sabbath school teacher, male or female, has a proclivity toward kids, that person is going to be pulled out and not placed in that position again. We have some fairly clear protocols to handle that issue. My question is, how do you deal with a pastor who has found to be a predator or a person who's involved in sexual misconduct? Can that person be restored? If so, how will that person be restored? And how would you suggest, if you agree, that they be restored?
So you used two different words there. You said predator and pastor who's engaged in sexual misconduct. And I thought that what Dr. Knight said earlier was very instructive, that most pastors engage in sexual assault, or not assault, but sexual misconduct. It's not about predation, it's about opportunism.
Make the distinction.
Well, a predator would be somebody who is lived a life constant looking for opportunity to seek and abuse others, and probably went to the seminary intentionally so they could be in positions of power to continue preying on women, right? There are such people that exist. But I think the point that's being made is that for most pastors who engage in sexual misconduct, they went to the seminary for right reasons, to preach the gospel, to be part of the community. They got out, they worked hard, they burned out, they got lonely, and then this opportunity, because of their power and influence, they fall into it. And in today's day and age of Me Too movement and cancel culture, our tendency is to say, one strike and you're out forever. But, you know, I was very interested to read Ellen White's counsels on sexual behavior and adultery. And she was more gracious than I would naturally want to be. And it seems that she recognized the difference between predators who, if you find a predator, they should never come back, versus people who are genuinely good pastors and good backgrounds and have burned out and have had a moral failing. And I'm not saying that should be swept under the rug and they should just be moved somewhere else, but there should be a process in place that these people can go through a period of healing and accountability and counseling and possibly emerge on the other end in some sort of pastoral role. And if you think that's radical, then you need to go and read Ellen White's books and what she said about pastors and evangelists to whom this happened.
How much should the church be aware of a process like that? Because it seems like things like this sometimes happen where we hear a story and then we see a pastor somewhere else, and there might be rumors that they went through a process, but church members are largely unaware of what process that was, if there was one at all. So how much should the layperson be aware of this process of restoration if that takes place?
So I'm sure others will have their views, but my conviction is that that those who are receiving the ministry of a pastor that is being restored should be aware of the decisions they're making to help restore that pastor. In other words, one conference shouldn't have a fallen pastor, work with him, counsel him, and then he gets a call to another conference who knows nothing of the situation, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying every person in the whole church, in the new church, should know, but the leadership team and group should know they are involved in restoration of a pastor who has fallen. They should make the choice to work with him based on full disclosure and knowledge.
It's great. Great. Anybody else want to tackle that? So go ahead.
Oh no, I was saying that was good.
I will say that, I mean, we have to get used to being uncomfortable, right? I mean, feeling uncomfortable is just a necessary part of unlearning the oppressive behaviors that have probably led us into the space that we're in right now. So we have to get used to being uncomfortable and recognize that what happens with abuse. So the most dangerous part of abuse is not what happens, but what happens when abuse happens, right? So what our response is, whether or not we, as he said, whether or not we remove people, whether or not we have some transparency going on, whether or not we have investigations, that becomes the really important part. What is the aftercare like?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I need to, there's some comments in the chats that there seems to be a misunderstanding. There's these two classes, the predator and the well-meaning but fallen pastor. I think the well-meaning but fallen pastor can possibly be restored. Predators should never be put back in positions of responsibility and leadership.
The thing about predators is, for example, if you are an alcoholic, you should never be again in a place where there is a lot of alcohol, and because you have a problem with it, and you will have it, and you will have to deal with it during your life. So when we talk about predators and people that have this conduct, and it's obsessive, it's compulsive, it's repeated, and it's with kids or things like that,
Yeah.
there is no
Gone.
chance that they could go back. But when there is a moral failure, that is the other part we are talking about, of a wonderful, good leader for most of the time that made a huge mistake, that's another conversation about restoration, maybe into a pastoral role again. Yeah, I hope we make that clear.
Yeah, well, some of this is almost impossible to make clear because the subjective description of a person's intentions, even the way you describe the motivations of predators and the thin line between a person who's clinically a predator and a person who just fell into it because of loneliness and whatnot. I guess to the victim, they're not making those distinctions. And so I'm sure that we need to err on the side of safety. I guess my question would be, how would the local church, how would you suggest a local church that has been confronted with a legitimate incident of, let's take the predator off of the table. But if we have an incident where a trusted local pastor or trusted local leader has gotten involved inappropriately, how should the local church respond to the victim and the victimizer?
Well, one of the things that I think we've kind of discussed as far as what you do to respond to someone who's been victimized is helping them understand that they have a safe space to be able to report things. And so that's one of the things that I was getting at. Not simply that we do not investigate or we do not assess, but that we do not elevate this idea of false accusations. I'm not saying that we don't assess for it. One of the things that Dr. Controlla Ard said is for every system and for every situation, we should be asking ourselves, so as we assess these things, we should be asking ourselves, who is benefiting from this? Who is gaining power? Because that's how you dismantle these systems of oppression. That's how you advocate for the vulnerable. That's how you protect people and prevent these moral failures, is that you ask yourself, who is gaining from this, right? Mm-hmm. Not simply that you sweep it under the rug because, people wouldn't be saying something false, but that you assess, but you create an environment where you don't elevate two things as if they're equal. So that's one of the things that we have to do, letting people know that they're believed.
Yeah, and I guess that thanks for that, because I guess what I'm trying to get at is, first of all, even before we get to the incident, how can we be more intentional about creating those safe spaces to prevent these types of incidents? Yeah.
You know, something that was.
Sorry,
No, go ahead, Adrienne.
I was just gonna say there's multiple conversations, trainings, teachings. Like this has to be an all hands on deck situation. You know, we have to every individual has to take personal accountability and responsibility for ourselves. To thine own self be true. That's one. Then we have to take ownership as well of mentoring, of agitating our leadership to the point where they cannot refuse to have the conversations. Right? We have many professionals within our church. It is time for us to raise up and open up our mouths and be a part of the solution in ways that cause a movement to say we will no longer accept these behaviors being swept underneath the rug. We will no longer accept pastors being moved from church to church. Cause the system to take the process and make it work. That's part of having the conversation and moving it forward.
Yeah, and we have to be intentional about the distribution of power, right? Take a look at Joe Biden's communications team, all women. That's what you do when you're serious about distributing power, right? We have to be serious about the distribution of power in our organization. So yes, personal responsibility and personal accountability, right? Very important, but we have to be explicit in training our ministers about being deliberate about giving power, like not just hoarding it to yourself, right? Requiring continuing education, right? That specifically addresses this, but also we have to look at our own organization. And I know we don't like to do that. And I know you didn't invite me on here to talk about just women's empowerment or women's ordination or any of those things. But when you have an organization that says this group can do something and that group cannot, you are creating a power differential. And that's what I started out by saying. When you have those power differentials, one group will be safe and one group will not. And we have to decide whether or not we believe that both groups of people should be safe. The people who are being victimized over and over, and the people who are obviously holding power over those individuals. We have to decide whether or not, as an organization, not just an individual, at an organizational level, are people being safe? Are people being treated fairly and equally?
Good stuff. Good stuff. Dr. Miller, you were saying something.
Well, I was just going to say a comment I saw much earlier on said, go to counseling and risk losing your job. Can pastors safely counsel? And it was pointed out that some conferences offer their pastors free counseling. I think they should go beyond that. I think all conferences should require their pastors to go to counseling at least once a year and just check in with a therapist, with a counselor. Maybe it used to be that crazy people went to counselors to live in a sane world. But this day, we live in a crazy world, and sane people need to go to counselors just to know how to get along with all the craziness around us. And we should completely destigmatize to the point of saying, you need to go to a counselor at least once a year. And, let us assess and it's not going to be a conference employee. It's going to be an outside counselor that has no contact with the conference. And I think that would go a long way to helping stabilize and prevent some of these people from sliding off.
I love the idea of removing the stigma. I think we need to normalize and just remove the shame from the idea that, yes, you can have great spiritual discernment and break down Bible texts in ways for all of us to understand something new about God's love, right? And yet you can still be negatively impacted by power without oversight, right? None of us are this good person that we're talking about, right? So removing the shame from even the fact that you are going to be corrupted if you do not have some type of accountability in place, right? That you still need to have boundaries, that you still need to have peers that you let in. You need to choose to be checked. I love what Pastor Myron Edmonds said years ago. I remember he said, I am not uncheckable. None of us are uncheckable. So recognizing that there is no shame in needing to be checked. There is no shame in needing accountability.
Yeah. Listen, let's do this. We're kind of coming to that to a point where we need to start wrapping it up. But I'd like to hear from each of you. You know the situation that we've been addressing. Again, the tagline talks about moral failure. We're speaking specifically about sexual misconduct. And so in your own way, just take a moment as we begin to wrap up. I'm going to start with Edsel, as a matter of fact. You've been passionate about our need to address this problem. So in your own way, what do you suggest we do going forward? And I guess I'm going to throw that to each of the panelists, and I'll start with Edsel Cadet. What would you suggest after all you've seen that we do going forward with this problem?
First thing I want to say is that we cannot afford to over spiritualize this. I think sometimes we use spirituality as a band-aid on this issue, and we think, well, if I'm converted, then I'm okay. And the truth is that your heart can be converted, but the neural pathways for your past behavior have already been formed, which means that as much as you've gone forward for the appeal, as much as you've prayed, as much as you've done all of these other things, your body will betray you, which is why you need oversight, which is why you need accountability, which is why you need somebody that you can confide in and that will be a Nathan to your David when you need that. I also believe that in terms of what do we do for victims, what we do now without an incident, without being driven by a crisis, says a lot to victims. It says a lot to whether or not they are safe to bring something forward. It speaks to our preparedness for when something does happen, because if you're waiting till something happens to build a system and to create a methodology of working through it or educating yourself on it, you will likely not do an adequate job. I also think that part of what might be able to help churches is for churches to partner with other churches in managing these situations. Sometimes your church only has 11 people. Sometimes your church only has 40 people. What do you do when it's an elder? What do you do when it's a pastor? Maybe your church should be pairing up with another church. They have a small body that comes and supports in these kinds of issues, and you have a small body that goes and supports them in these kinds of issues. But we have to start getting more creative about and more proactive about handling these matters when they arise.
Good. Chaplain, what would you say to that? What would you suggest we do going forward?
Most definitely. So one, I would definitely say for the pastors, this is a great time to do a self-check, a great time to sit and have a conversation with God and yourself and say, who am I? What are those sins that so easily beset me? Align yourself with the resources that are available. This is the time to put pride to the side and allow yourself to open up. This is a great time as well to know what are the resources that are available to assist you and your congregation. This is a great time to know what are the processes that are in place, the processes that are in place. We perish for lack of knowledge, but it's not like the knowledge is unattainable. So this is a wonderful time to stop and to get educated. And then finally, we need battle buddies. Please don't try to do this on your own. The Bible says iron sharpens iron. So for those of you who are there, if you are in a place where your weaknesses are easily besetting you right now, accountability. Ask God to show you who is that person to walk that journey with you. If you have been victimized and you feel like you are all alone and you don't know who to turn to, ask God to open up the door and show you where that resource is so that you can move forward.
Good stuff. Is Pastor Bruno still with us?
No.
Dee, what would you say?
Yeah, I'm just going to echo something that Chaplain Benton said. If I could just take a quick second to give you a relevant example. In 1999, Payne Stewart's jet flew 1,400 miles off course from the flight plan where they were supposed to be headed. But the only people who knew were the air traffic controllers. Those are the people where they filed the flight plan, right? From the ground, everything looked normal until they crashed. But before they crashed, the air traffic controllers sent up like some pilots, right? Just to check and see what's going on. They said that the windows were frosted over, autopilot was on, but it's believed that everyone on board had already perished. And I just want to know, when you are dying inside, when there's something going on, you've got some internal turmoil and you've got some loneliness and secrets that you've been keeping, who are your tower people? Where are the people who know your flight plan, right? Who knows the trajectory of your story and where your life course is supposed to go? Because those are the people who should be checking on you. And people will often say, well, how are you supposed to like build in somebody who checks on you? Okay, who are the people who both check you and celebrate you? So I'm not listening to people who are just checking me, because those are haters, right? I'm not listening to people who just celebrate me. Those are people who are going to blow my head up, right? But leaders, pastors specifically, right? Often they report that they have no close friends. If no one in your inner circle is telling you you're wrong, you need a new inner circle. So start right now thinking to yourself, who told me I was wrong? And when last have I been told that I was going the wrong direction in something, right? You need new people in your tower. You need to surround yourself with people who have the courage to disagree with you, people who can both celebrate you and check you. That is required. It's not, I'm not just willy-nilly giving advice here, right? Leadership demands accountability. So leading in a godly way requires you to position yourself in such a way that you intentionally invite people to tell you the truth. And I'll leave you with something that I love that Joseph Grenny said. He said, the myth that we cannot both tell the truth and keep friends is at the heart of most of our dysfunction. The myth that we cannot both tell the truth and keep friends is at the heart of most of our dysfunction.
Say it one more time.
Okay, come on. The myth that we cannot both tell the truth and keep friends is at the heart of most of our dysfunction. It's not enough to simply personally not be abusive. You have to be anti-abuse. It's not enough to simply personally not wield powers in ways that are harmful. You have to be anti-establishment and policies that systemically disempower one group while empowering another, because that's what it takes to do justice. That's what it takes to love mercy, to walk humbly. That's what it takes to protect the image of God in the people of God.
Good stuff. So, Dr. Miller, we're going to give you the last word here. Could you just
how can I follow that? Sister dropping truth bombs like the world is over. What am I going to do?
Yeah, I'm trying to help you out, man. I'm trying to I'm talking it down, man. I'm talking it down. But why don't you take it? And I want to know a little bit about the Safe Church also, and then I'll wrap it up.
Yeah, sure. And this is a very important time together. Consciousness raising is very, very important. Sharing these wonderful ideas is very, very important. But as a historian and a lawyer, I can tell you that if we don't take these good ideas and systematize them and put them into structures and institutions, they're going to evaporate along with our Zoom conference, right?
Yeah.
And so, and passing policies isn't the solution, because we have a great policy in here. It's just flesh hasn't been put on it. But I think the challenge is to take the wonderful ideas that we've heard here and say to our conference leaders and our union leaders and our division leaders, we're really concerned about this. There seems to be a really great policy. Why isn't this policy being implemented? Like about 90% of the stuff that we're talking about here would be taken care of if this was actually being put into place. And I have put a couple of links in the chat on Facebook. One that takes you to the Lake Union webpage, where we've linked to E87, to flow charts and outlines and descriptions of it. And another that takes you to actually the Project Safe Church reporting page, where victims can go and submit confidential reports and start the process. We've done it one way. It's not necessarily the perfect way, but at least it's a model. It's a start. And if we start banging on our leaders, and I totally resonate with Dr. Knight in terms of the men are in charge, the men have the power, the men see a certain way. It's not that they're always trying to protect bad people, but it's that they're thinking about it in a certain way. And we need women who are thinking about it in another way. And these sexual ethics committees give equal representation to men and women. And so now we can have some equality at the table of those groups that are actually looking into these things. And so I would just urge that we take these wonderful ideas and we channel them into pressing our leaders to put these policies actually into place.
I love it. Listen, I can't tell you guys how much I appreciate, and I think I'm speaking for everybody. I just can't say enough about how valuable your contributions have been. We've heard from Adrienne Benton, Nestor Bruno, Nicholas Miller, Dee Knight, and Edsel Cadet. You have done a tremendous job. We want to remind everybody that we are wanting to continue this conversation, among others, even during PELC. And so make sure that you register for PELC 2020. We're going to begin on Sunday night, December 6th through Wednesday, December the 9th. And we're encouraging you to go to pelk2020.com to register. Again, I want to say I appreciate so much Kim Mann and Richard Martin and Edsel Cadet and Amanda Harley and Deandra Jackson, Ainsworth Joseph, the team that has put together these series of Am I OK webinars. Between now and Sunday night, when we convene PELC 2020, we're going to run some webinars that we've previously done. So stay tuned. Look us up on Facebook and on YouTube. We'll get the information to you guys. I appreciate everything you've done. Have a great day.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson.
Yes, yes, yes.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.